Okay, so here we are, the return. Hang on, we'll start in a minute. The return of Graham M Bray. Two grumpy old men discuss SF. This time, we're just doing some reviews, aren't we?
We are.
We have all these...
Talk about our recent reads.
Recent reads. Something which we have these grandiose schemes to do these wonderful thematic things, which we will get in, which we've done a few
century.
of. 1 century, some century, maybe in the distant future.
Century soon.
Yeah, but we're just going to do some reviews today because of what we've been reading. We haven't done one of these for 3 months. So you've been reading and rereading a lot. I've got a few things I've read as well. We're going to try and work roughly chronologically backward in time. The arrow of time is going to move backwards, so this is a tachyon express as we send the particle back in time in terms of like the old John Carpenter Prince of Darkness thing. So we're going to start with some new stuff and move back to some old school business, as you young uns like to say. So I think we're going to begin with something we both read, aren't we? Titanium Noir.
Yes, this is about as recent as you get.
Came out about a month and a half ago. And I did mention this and show it on my channel. And I was quite excited about it. Then I started to read it. And I will say I was less excited. I'll do a quick intro. I'm going to let you take over then. Because Nick Harkaway is John le Carré's son. He's done about 4 or 5 books, I think. Is this the 4th or 5th?
There's 5.
Five. Yeah. And I have read Nomon, which is his previous one, which was massive, which is a little bit Neil Stephenson, bit of a police procedural. And it was too long, even though it was interesting. So I was quite excited by the fact that this was quite short and sharp. There we go. So Graham, you're going to lead off with that, and then I'm going to sort of add my bits. So I'll let you. So if I hold it up and you talk, as you can see, we're doing the Scott Bradfield sophisticated approach of, no whiteboard, no pixels, all that stuff. And as Scott says, so we're just going to show you the book thus. So what did you think? What was your
it's another sort of police procedural in the future.
Absolutely.
About this guy who is not actually in the police. He's, what are the phrases for it? He's
a consultant.
Yeah, consultant.
Yeah, he's a special consultant, isn't he?
Yeah. And he is investigating the death of somebody who's is it Titan?
A Titan, yeah. A genetically engineered immortal. There's this thing, it costs lots of money, doesn't it, to have it done to yourself. And what happens is that you get physically really big, you're like a giant. And there are the Titans are a kind of pariah elite, I would say. There's a small number of them. They're all quite big. They're going to live a long time. And anyway, go from there. Yeah. So
and they all live happily ever after.
Except the one who gets murdered.
Except the one who gets murdered. Yeah. And my own reaction to it is very mixed because when I first started reading it, I did not like it at all. I didn't like the way it was written particularly, and I didn't particularly like the main character.
Right.
But weirdly, it kind of won me over.
Oh, really?
And I don't know when it was partly because it was short. It helped it.
Yeah, that does help.
A lot.
Yeah.
But I did I read it. I wouldn't give it much more than about 5 out of 10 or something.
Yeah.
But I enjoyed it up to a point.
I mean, what attracted me to this was the fact that, compared to Nomon, his previous book, it is quite short and sharp, which I like, as you know.
The previous ones are huge.
Yeah, they're massive. Yeah, and they does seem to be developing an idea on this channel that I don't like books which are big just because they're big. I like some big books, but not many books need to be big to get across what they want to say. And I think Nick Harkaway would have benefited from that. And what interested me about this was the basic idea of the plot of this murder mystery around this super elite in the future who get physically very big and they're kind of supermen and they're going to live a long time. It reminded me of the kind of thing that, say, Silverberg or Dick would have done in the 60s, because it's quite a pulpy sort of plot and idea. And I was attracted to that, and I thought, well, let's see what he does with it.
Well, the way he kind of creates the future world is very much like, well, I guess it's like a lot of cyberpunk and stuff like that. The kind of feel of the
the setting is quite interesting. But I think with me, to begin with, I really enjoyed it, and I was enjoying it, but I DNF'd it, and I probably should have finished it, but I got the point where I wasn't enjoying it, and I've got a very firm rule, which is it doesn't matter if you're not enjoying it, put it down. You might go back to it another time. What I found really frustrating was I felt that a lot of the writing, particularly the dialogue between the consultant and the people he was interviewing and encountering to try and get to what was happening with the murder at the time it was trying really hard to be snappy and fast and wisecracking. And there's this terrible thing, and I'm sure Nick Harkway has read lots of real noir, lots of hard-boiled, is that there are a lot of people writing SF novels which think they're drawing on that tradition of 30s, 40s American crime. And you can tell very often those people haven't read those things because they're dealing in cliches, which they've mostly picked up from the bad end of film noir. And what I found was, because he does this thing a lot, which fills up the pages where there's a snappy dialogue, and after about 4 or 5 lines, because the dialogue is more or maybe too focused, I should say, on being snappy and clever and comebacks and what have you, that you forget who's actually talking. Now, that's a lot to do with attention span, and my attention was wavering because, having read lots of classic American hardboiled and noir from the 30s, 40s, 50s and beyond, I found that really, really crass. And my feeling was that what Harkway was really doing, he was really writing a crime novel. And I'm always saying this, a lot of SF has crime novel plots just in the future. And there's nothing wrong with that. Crimes of the future, as David Cronenberg would say. But this really wanted to be more of a crime novel than an SF novel, I felt. Did you find, were there conceptual breakthroughs at the end? Were there exciting and interesting things about the Titans and their place in society or what have you? Did he deliver on any of that front?
Probably not.
Well, there you go. So did it just work for you on the level of a police procedural set in the future? Yeah. So it was the tone that didn't get me. And it's interesting because I put this down in frustration. And I'm not really reading a lot of crime these days because, as you know, and I think I've said on the channel a few times, I read a lot of crime from about 2010 to 2020. A lot of it was for work, and I was reading lots of Italian crime, which is one of my things. And I just got fed up with it. And when you like a genre like SF, which is very broad, you can always find bits and pieces. A genre like crime, which is the most popular genre, is a little less diverse, and it will go back to certain things like the police procedural and what have you. So it will centre around certain types of crime. Murder is the obvious one. And I picked this up. This is Ross MacDonald, the underground man in Penguin Classics. Now, Ross MacDonald is somebody I've been aware of since the 80s. He's one of the classic American, I would say, hard-boiled writers. He started sort of coming up in the 50s. This is from about 1969. And there's a load of books featuring this character called Lou Archer. And I've been meaning to read them for ages. And a friend of mine in work has been saying, oh, Steve, you'd love these. And I don't know why I never read him at the time, but I got round to it. And when I started to read this, it had every virtue of excellent crime writing that the Nick Harkway book didn't have. It had a wonderful atmospheric beginning, very carefully written. And something that MacDonald does in this, and it's not about a murder, not initially, it's about a child abduction, and you're actually witnessing the abduction very early on in the first 2 pages, is that the characters are introduced one by one. They're beautifully drawn, very deft, and it takes its time. If anything, it's a little bit too long, I would say. And that's relating to my general sort of feeling where I'm rather fed up with the plots of crime novels. And what he does really well in this is he introduces characters one by one, sometimes 2 at a time, as the investigation goes forward, because it's a live investigation and he's a private eye. Lou Archer's a private eye in Los Angeles. And what's brilliant about it is that he does that thing that Ted Lewis does in Get Carter, Jack's Return Home, where gradually everybody that's introduced into the plot is in some way implicated or connected to what's going on. But at the same time, there's some wonderful background stuff. In this, there's a fire going on, like a forest fire, like you have a lot in California now. And this is about 1970, as I say. So there's some background psychedelic colour detail. But you have the sense of the real world around the story, and that's really beautifully done, and it's wonderfully well written. And also it has that great balance of plot and character coming together, and incident and character driving plot the way it does in the real world, with a certain sort of focus in that things sort of come into it and some of them feel a little bit artificial because it's the conventions of solving the murder, and it gets a very twisty point towards the end where you're not sure which way it's going to go. And I did get a bit fed up with that. But in terms of the quality of the writing and the way you construct a crime narrative, you put some real world stuff around it to make it realistic, and you get a really good period feel. I couldn't fault this. I mean, I'm not going to read any more by him for some time because I am bored with the conventions of the murder mystery and those things. But this was like a bucket of water in the face compared to the Nick Harkaway books. I was saying, if you're going to write a science fiction crime story, work on the style as well as the content, work on the real world. So the world building in this, which is realistic world building, kicked that out of the park for me. So if you want to read some really well written American noir, give this a try. Good stuff. And there's lots of others. Penguin do about 5 or 6 of them, and there's some more being reissued or reprinted round about now. So that kind of saved it for me. So I tell you what, you have that, right? And give it a go and let me know what you think when you get to it. So there we are. Now, some new SF, a book which I mentioned on my channel when I did.
You did.
Yeah, new SF for last year.
I mentioned on Outlaw Bookseller,
whoever it is.
Yeah. And I saw it in the bookshop, Bath's Premier Bookshop, which I won't mention.
Yeah.
Cheesy's, I call it.
Yeah.
But basically I thought I would give this a go.
Yeah.
Did you read it? Oh.
I didn't. I read about it, and I was interested in the fact that it's a hard SF novel by a young female writer, and it's set on Pluto.
It
is.
is.
Much set on Pluto. Pluto's a planet. We want it back as a planet.
Well, it's because of the mission that went there a few years ago.
Yeah.
Which I've immediately forgotten what it was called.
And it's got, nice recommendations in the back from Baxter, Cornell and Macaulay. So what was it like, Graham? Was it good?
It is a hard SF novel, as you say.
Yeah.
So she is a scientist. But it is fundamentally about life on Pluto, when there is any.
Right.
And it's about terraforming.
Right.
And obviously terraforming and indigenous life perhaps don't go together very well.
No.
So, and that is fundamentally what it's about. It's about a group of people there who are searching for life.
Right.
Where others are involved in the terraforming project.
Yeah, because Pluto's quite small.
It
strikes me as difficult to sort of terraform it way out there on the edge of the solar
what
system.
they do is they build a mirror that and if mirror is quite the right word, but it magnifies the light of the sun, so it will gently warm it up.
There was quite a lot said in the sort of publicity about this, about the relationship between the central character, who's female, and her brother and father. Is that right? Was that? Am I misremembering?
Yes. Yeah. Well, they have their own itinerary, shall we say?
Yeah.
And it's all to do with money, and so I'm trying to avoid giving any spoilers.
We don't want spoilers. No.
And basically, they force this girl who's like 8 years old to shut up.
Right.
To not give away what she's discovered.
Right. Okay.
And she literally shuts up. So this guy who is the main character in many ways, who comes to set up the terraforming project, he sets about trying to understand what her problem is, to try and get her to speak. And,
right. Okay.
So that is kind of going against what her father and her brother, who are trying to get her to shut up.
Family conflict. Yeah. So, what would you say? Would you recommend this, and who would you recommend it to?
Well, I'd recommend it to people who like hard SF.
Yeah.
Because it's 400 pages long, but I did read it quite quickly.
Yeah.
It was a bit of a page turner.
Stylistically, does she have a future as a writer?
The ideas about when the mystery of when there's life there and so forth is compelling enough,
right?
To draw me through the book.
So
and terraforming is an interesting subject to me, as I'm a great believer in wilderness and the idea of going to Mars and destroying,
changing it.
I just think is profoundly wrong. The only real criticism is the prose style is workmanlike. That is the best I would describe it as. There's nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly readable. But you don't come out remembering certain paragraphs.
I mean, isn't that a marker though of
modern
a lot of let's not say modern, let's say contemporary hard SF, is that in the 1970s something we saw with people like Gregory Benford when he was coming up was that they tried to take some of the experimentation literary quality of new wave and English SF and apply it to hard SF narratives with a reasonable degree of success, but that seems to have faded away again now, isn't it? So,
everyone just wants to write something that's proficient, but I imagine that is maybe they don't read literary books,
proficient,
they want things
but
that
not
are easy.
stylish. So I would probably not read that, but it is interesting, set on Pluto. So there we go. Thanks for that.
I don't regret reading it.
There we go. Doesn't regret reading it.
I enjoyed it.
Man who likes a bit of hard SF. Also on the contemporary front, something which I've been reading, and I've been reading this piecemeal because this is a debut collection, and this is Out There by Kate Folk. Out There. And this is published by Hodder Studio in Scepter, who are doing some interesting stuff at the moment. And a friend of mine I worked with said this was his favourite science fiction book last year in hardcover. And I did look at it then, but I decided to wait. And a lot of writers now, particularly in the mainstream literature, are debuting with a short story collection, which is a good way of doing it because you're growing up in public, you experiment and what have you, and it gives people a taste, and you can work towards your first novel. And Kate Folk is relatively young, and basically it says on the back of this, let's see, the literary love child of Kafka and Camus and Bradbury penning episodes of Black Mirror. Now, as soon as I hear the phrase Black Mirror, I reach for my revolver, because when anybody ever says it's Black Mirror-like, I think, you lightweight. You know, this stuff is decades and decades and decades behind written SF from the 60s and what have you. So I can't take it seriously. And I know I'm being biased. I'm sure some of Black Mirror is okay, but I just can't take it seriously. It also talks about body horror. And it says that the stories in it definitely combine SF and horror to uncover an unforgettable vision of the absurdity of life in the digital age. Now, what's interesting about a lot of contemporary writers is that even though there's always been SF in the mainstream, it is increasingly part of what young, upcoming contemporary writers do, even if they do want a career in genre SF. And this is not published as a genre SF book. Not every story in this is SF. It's very much a case of a book which uses science fiction and science fiction tropes, and not in a bad way, not always in a great way, but it was very interesting. And I like Out There as a title. It's really good and quite old school. And really, just to focus on a couple of the stories in here, the title story is the narrative of a young woman who is sort of rather fed up with relationships and what's happening in her life. And there's a new type of tech. There are these men out there called blots, who are artificial human beings, and you can't tell by looking. They're sort of like genetically engineered androids or clones or something. And sorry about the vagueness, but you know, it's not one of those things where it goes into the science and stuff. And they form relationships with people, particularly women, so they can steal their data. And she wants to avoid them, and lots of girls saying, well, how do we avoid these guys, you know, because they're the blots. They always look great, they're always compliant, they're always helpful and friendly, and they seem like the perfect boyfriend, but they lack the rough edges. And it's about how she goes through relationships, and they start okay, they're not entirely sophisticated. She sort of thinks, well, this is like a routine treadmill, and then what she decides to do about the blots. And it is quite interesting. There's a very sort of cynical, contemporary tone, which reminds me of people from the 80s like Mary Gateskill and, you know, even Jane McInerney, without the sort of sentiment. And there's a really funny story about a woman who decides that she's fed up with people shooting deer. So she decides that she's going to impersonate a deer and get shot in a forest, so that then the hunters feel really guilty that they've shot and they'll never shoot a deer again. And she enters into this bizarre pact with a young guy who's going to shoot her for some money so that she can fulfill this. And there's lots of other things. And, you know, there's some great ideas in it. And it's quite witty at times. And there's one story called Head in the Floor, which is about a head which comes out of the floor in somebody's bathroom or one of the rooms. It reminded me very much of a similar story in a book called Cursed Bunny, which I read recently. And I had mixed feelings about it. But if you want to look at what's happening on the edges, where SF influences, genre SF influences are bleeding into the mainstream, which they're always doing, and how people who are developing their careers in literary fiction are looking and using SF, Out There is worth a look. Give it a go, my old chum. You might like some of it. You can pick up bits and pieces. For me, it was kind of a 6 to 8 out of 10. It is going to be interesting to see what she does when she does a novel. Then we move on to a book which our little chum Matt Defoe at Science Fiction Reads has mentioned a few times.
He has, yes.
Semiosis by Sue
Well, I was looking for something contemporary to read. So when he mentioned this, so I had a look in a certain bookshop in Bath. Which has cheese involved in it,
right, okay.
And I found this.
I considered when it came out, I thought about it. Arthur C. Clarke.
Yes, won the
Arthur C. Clarke, which is good.
And there is a sequel to it,
yes,
which obviously they don't stock.
Yeah.
So I only have a.
Possibly because nobody bought that before.
Well, I get the impression though.
Because that's what people.
But they did have it, which in itself is a miracle.
Right.
You know.
Yeah.
But it was published in 2018.
Yeah.
So it's
5 years ago. To us, that's yesterday.
So to me, that's modern.
So tell me all about it. Well, I look at the back again and remind myself.
Yeah. Well, it's a book about people. Well, basically a bunch of colonists moving to an alien world. It's one of these kind of, you bugger off and there's no support from Earth or anything like that. So they're on their own. They're going to have to make what they can of it and survive. And they discovered it's vaguely Earth-like world, but there's a lot of strange differences, like there are intelligent plants and stuff like that.
So there's an interesting biosphere.
Yes, there is.
And quite a diverse and fecund one by the sound of it.
Also, the one quite interesting aspect is the planet has had colonists in the past.
Oh, right. That is
who have regressed.
Right, okay.
So, because the plants like manipulating people.
Right. And the planet is called Pax, which of course is Latin for peace.
Peace, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a utopian community as well as
sort of, yes. Yeah.
And a book which again I know Matt Defoe likes and which I know you and I enjoyed as well, which has this thing about an interesting biosphere is Bios by Robert Charles Wilson. Yeah. Where everything is utterly deadly to sort of invaders or colonists. Yeah. And Adrian Tchaikovsky liked this, and so they're probably chums or something. Because there's a lot of nepotism. Not to say that Sue and Adrian are nepotists, but this is a fact. Why you look at books and you think, why does every book you ever pick up have a blurb saying it's brilliant? It's a lot of nepotism, and it's always been there. People say, Tim, the good doctor, told me a story about a Bristol-based SF author was talking to a more famous Bristol-based SF author about blurbs, and he was pretty much saying, "Oh, would you do a blurb for my book?" And the more famous author said, "Oh, I only do them for my friends," which implied that the guy doing the asking wasn't his friend, and that just goes to show they should purely be done on literary merit. Like John Clute wouldn't do that. Now, John Clute, if he was your mate or mine and we wrote a book, if he thought it sucked, he'd say, wouldn't he? That's the thing, and that's criticism for you. He did it in a really good way, Mike. But there you go. So, what do you reckon? So.
But it's quite. I like it. It's quite episodic. It's spread over tens of years.
Right.
So you tend to move from one
long form narrative.
Yes. Yeah. So you tend to move from one character to another.
Yeah.
And the older characters are still around, but kind of fade into the background.
Senescent.
And it's quite a lot of politics in it. Trying to work out how people should run this planet.
Yeah.
Because they got this idea. I mean, the name Pax.
Yeah.
These are people who believe in peace and non-violence, all this kind of thing. So I think, isn't she a lot older?
I don't know.
I'd look her up and find that she'd been around.
She spent many years working as a reporter and editor for Variety. But this is the thing. I mean,
it has more of a feel of almost a book written in the past.
What I find with contemporary British SF, at least, is that the best writers are people who've been around a long time. Some of them, like Dave Hutchinson, for example, had a career in journalism. He wrote some stuff early on, and then decades of no books whatsoever. And these are people who come into their own when they're in their 50s and early 60s. I mean, Chris Beckett,
I think she might be one of those.
It's like, so there you go.
But
so
I ought to check that.
Yeah.
But I only just thought of it. So,
the implication is there, isn't it? So there we are.
The only thing that I found less enjoyable about it is I didn't find it a particularly easy read. It's one of these books that you kind of read 10 pages and put it down.
Yeah.
But it doesn't, as opposed to Pluto Shine, where I might read 40 pages.
Yeah.
But it is
a more the episodic structure.
Yes, it's the episodic structure, but it's also more literary, I suspect.
Right. Yeah. So you're seeing a series of snapshots.
Yes.
So there anybody who wants a comfortable character who will carry them through, somebody they can like, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is another thing. I mean, something I've said a number of times, and it. I'm aware of this, and obviously I've seen it many times in my job, and you see it, is that it's people's expectations of what a book should be like, the colours their views. And I would say if you come to SF, you shouldn't have expectations, or you should sometimes want them to be overturned. And we all find certain styles or approaches more attractive, but it is about the overturning them. So that sounds quite interesting.
Yeah.
So should I give it a try?
I would certainly read the first page or two, and
I will give it a go and see what happens. So, thanks for that, Graham. It's interesting because I am struggling to read contemporary SF, not with the We're the Only Ones, as we've said. So what else have we got? What have we read recently? What's more recent? Is there something, because the books I have here are from the 70s.
Well, that's 90s.
Right, okay, 90s.
That is about 2000.
Okay.
So I would suspect.
So we have a look at Ian R. MacLeod next. Yeah, okay. So we've got Red Snow. That's very handsome, isn't it?
Yeah,
Isn't
it's
that
a beautiful book.
Yeah, and that's from PS. I'm sure I've seen this on the PS website at some point. That's really fantastic, isn't it? Yeah, okay. And that's Ian R. MacLeod. I always struggle with authors who have Mac or Muck in their name. Not to be confused with Ian MacDonald. Yeah. So this is Ian R. MacLeod.
Which is a short story collection. I've been trying to avoid binging authors, but I read these two together.
Yeah.
So
I remember Breath Marks. Yeah. Who's that published by?
That's Golden Griffin.
Golden Griffin. Another good small press. Very nice.
American publisher.
Lovely stuff.
I've read a few books of his over the years, and he's very much the literary end of SF. And
I don't think I've ever read him. I think I've got some books by him, but like I say, I've got this terrible blind spot for people with Muck and Mac in the name. Anyway, go further, speak more, tell me more. So tell us about Red Snow, and I'll have a look at this.
Red Snow, it's a full-length novel. It's not a novella or anything. Yeah. And it is primarily about vampires.
Ah, right, okay.
And it's set over centuries, basically following the same individual who, because they've been infected as...
Very much like Chelsea Cunningham Saint Germain series and spin-off. Okay, we'll come back to that. Go on, right.
The interesting thing about it is it starts with his character killing vampires.
Oh, right. Okay.
So that is kind of his approach to these things.
Right. So the vampire kills vampires?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, he wants to try and get at the person who infected him.
Right. Okay.
So, but it is nothing like the cliched Hollywood kind of vampires at all.
So these are scientific vampires rather than supernatural.
Yes. Well, but they're ordinary people who are get infected through.
Right.
However, I mean the main character was infected during the American Civil War.
Oh, okay.
So literally, some people on the battlefield who were
all right. Laminated boards, as you see, very beautiful. And apart from those aspects, what sort of attracted you to it? How did you find it? What have you?
Well, everything about it, really. The cover, the title, the James Goddard mentioned
Jim, Leaky Boot and Kerosene.
In a response to
Jim.
And I thought, I've read,
didn't he?
I've read books by him.
And
Jim
I thought I
should read that one.
Right.
So I wish I had all his books, but
does sound good. And I mean, if Jim says it's good, it's always worth a try because Jim published some great books.
I mean, of these books, it is the best.
Yeah. What can you say to somebody who published people like Keith Roberts, Richard Cowper, Gene Wolfe?
It's an example of something you read for the quality of writing, and the ideas are in
beautiful book. Yeah. So there you go. So intelligent literary SF vampire novel,
compellingly.
Good stuff.
Written.
Right, and very beautiful as well. So it probably might cost you a pretty penny out there. And the short story collection you mentioned as well. So, what about that?
Well, this again, for both these books reflect well his attitude to genre.
Yes.
As he is, there must be a phrase I can't think of here, but his books are cross genre. So there's fantasy, there's fantasy, horror.
He just writes fiction.
Yeah. Okay. It's basically, it's as you say, it's like he writes fiction. But the thing that amuses me, the very first short story in that, he uses loads of words and phrases to describe creatures on an alien planet.
Oh, the binding.
Yeah. He uses loads of
blue leather
words to describe like alien life forms, but he doesn't explain any of it. And I think that is brilliant because, if you were there, that is how you would see it.
Yes.
And you discover what things are as you go along.
That's a bit Cordwainer Smith, isn't it? Yeah, which we like. Yeah. Beautiful book. Again.
But the strongest story is the last one, which I've forgotten what it's called. the Summer Isles, which is completely different to everything else I've mentioned today.
Okay.
It's about this guy living in sort of the 1930s, 1940s in a alternative reality.
Oh, right.
Where the kind of Walter Mosley and people like that are the people in power.
Fascism.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
really?
he's friends with the guy who was Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And he actually had a homosexual relationship with the guy.
Oh, okay.
Which means he is kind of waiting
Yeah.
for the knock on the door.
And that's about 70,
and he will be
70 pages.
yeah, there is a
novel,
full-length novel of it as well.
Okay.
Which I haven't read.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, he's somebody... I don't think I've ever read him. I've always been aware of him. What has he done recently? Is he the guy who did that Lunar series?
No, I see McDonald.
That's McDonald, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not, because I get confused with the two. Yeah, very beautiful book, and I'll watch out for that because
I ought to brought some of his other books down, but
one day all books will be made that way. And
loads
they'll
of them
be
were published by
Steve,
PS.
right?
Yeah, they've also been published by Transworld. And people like that.
Yeah, he's had a big mainstream career as well, hasn't he?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
very, very beautiful. So recommend it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'll put that on. Steve will put that on his list because it's lovely.
Yeah.
I must see if Honest Bob in Dorset has got one. Marvellous stuff. So we're moving back a little bit further back in time. We've still got some things to get through. I think you should go again and we should look at this. Now, this fella, Jim Crace, published his first novel in hardcover in 1986 in Heinemann. Continent. And I remember it well because it was a very beautiful little book. It was very short and sharp and fleet, as I always say, shorter than this. And I think it was shortlisted for some awards. And I remember it well because it was published at $4.95 in hardcover. Now, that was cheap for hardcover even then. And that was an experiment. And his work has often had fantastic elements in it, hasn't it?
Yeah.
I haven't read it for years. And what was the second book? Gift of Stones?
Gift of Stones, yeah.
Gift of Stones?
Yeah.
Is Gift of Stones the one with the historical sort
yes,
of Celtic?
It's kind of...
Because I haven't read them for decades.
Almost Stone Age kind of thing. Which I read that.
Yeah.
I read his first Continent. I didn't massively enjoy that.
Continent was interesting.
Strength of Stones I thought was really good.
This is the Pest House.
Yeah.
Now, he did have a major bestseller with Quarantine? Now, Quarantine must be about 10, 15 years ago, and that's the one about Jesus, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
So, there we go. And this is an SF novel.
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
okay. Tell us more about it.
Yeah, well, it's set in a sort of post-apocalypse America.
Yeah.
Where basically, like so many of these things, it isn't described what happened.
Yeah.
Everything has fallen apart. And it's a... kind of, I guess you could call it road movie novel kind of thing. It's about a bunch of people who are trying to leave America. Interesting enough, they're all trying to get to the coast in order to catch a ship.
America is killing its youth, as the punk band Suicide said. Yeah.
In order to leave America,
the
belief that things are better elsewhere.
Yeah.
Though, of course, we don't actually know.
No.
Quite.
Okay.
How localised the issues are.
This is Picador, and Picador to me now is an imprint which has completely lost its identity. It still had some credibility in it. It's still great then. But this looks really good. And I do remember it coming out, and this is about 3 or 4 years before Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which, I mean, The Road isn't a massive original book. It's very well written. So that tradition... Could we say, I mean, they're always there, but there's been more of them since this was around. So maybe this is when the books have rebooted the post-apocalyptic tradition. And Jim Crace is British, isn't he?
He is,
yes. Even though this is set in the States. And, he's an amazing literary career. Whitbread Novel of the Year. Quarantine was 1998, which was longer than I thought when he won that. Shortlisted for the Booker Prize, National Book Critics Award. And, so good stuff. And he does a book about every 4 or 5 years. So there we are. And what else can we say about this?
It's very well written.
Yeah.
Like Ian.
Yeah.
I
should probably read it, shouldn't I? Because I've not read it for years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You read it for the writing as much as anything else.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
right.
It's quite visual.
Right. Yeah. And as a post-apocalyptic narrative, is it sparse? Is it lush? Where does it fall on the spectrum of the descriptive end of things?
Well, I would say it's more lush than sparse, but it's so I'd say it's following basically 2 characters who are travelling in the belief.
Which of course is what happens in The Road.
It's quite similar in that level.
Right, okay.
And they're passing through various places where various horrible things are happening.
Going on,
like there's a major disaster right in the beginning of the book, which wipes out loads of people.
Yeah. So this is closer to Earth Abides than The Road, we would say. Okay, well that sounds great. I really need to put this back on my list. I've not read him for years, and he is really good. There we go, Jim Crace. Somebody maybe you should give a try. I'm certainly going to give that a go as well. Thanks for that. That's
a lot of his books have a historical. They're saying historical times, but they often have a kind of ghost story type feel too.
He's a literary writer who, like literary writers have always done, works within things which we now think of as genres. So that's an interesting thing. And if you look at the history of the modern novel and modern short stories, and by modern I don't mean now, that's contemporary. People are flinging the term modern. Modern ended ages ago. So it is that thing where these people have always been there. That looks great. And as you have read him, you actually got me very excited about this.
Yeah.
Speaking about those sort of narratives, I want to flip back now because that makes a lot of sense with. Now this isn't a very exciting looking book, but it is a book which I reread recently by somebody I've talked about a lot on the channel, and that's Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough. And in a recent haul video, I showed you another copy of this. This is False Dawn in Sidgwick Silver. That's what I call these, the Sidgwick Silvers. Nice plain livery. And this is from about 78, which is fairly early in Chelsea's career. She's written 100 books. She can write science fiction, fantasy, horror, historical fiction, children's fiction, history books. She can do it all. She's genius, brilliant writer, very, very good, massively underrated, probably my living female writer of the fantastic per se. And I've read, I'm nearly on 40 books by her now, and she's great. Now this is False Dawn, and False Dawn is a post-apocalyptic narrative. It's from the late 70s, 78, and it shows, what's good about this is that, again, I would say if I thought Cormac McCarthy was actually reading this sort of thing, which I bet he wasn't, he might have read the Jim Crace, of course. That's a possibility, it strikes me. And if he'd read this, I don't think he would have. Again, there's comparisons to this as well. And if you like that sort of narrative, I really recommend this. Because the beauty of this book is it falls in between the full-blown Mad Max, boy and his dog, mutants, lots of really rough, tough stuff going on, with a more sort of considered, realistic approach that you get in things like The Road and in the book you've just described, the Jim Crace book, The Pest House. So that's what you get in this. And predominantly, there are two characters, a female character and a male character. And the male character is the former leader of a gang of outlaws and predators who are sort of roving the land. And they are called the Pirates. And he has sort of been cast out, and he falls in with this woman. And the apocalypse has been going on for quite some time. And what's good about this is there's a multi sort of, how can I put it? It's not just one thing. This is not like a nuclear apocalypse. Lots of different things have happened and conspired, and in contingency has brought them together, and the world has come crashing down. And they include wars, pollution, all sorts of things. And it's made the world increasingly unfit to live in. Animals are struggling to reproduce, the environment's affected, people affected, and it's been a gradual thing. So you see this new order or new disorder emerging. It's set in North America, and these two characters fall in with each other, and they go in this hegira across the states. And Chelsea actually says in a little forward that if you follow, if you get some certain maps, you can follow where they go. She doesn't put maps in this, even though she is a cartographer as well, very talented woman. And you get this little thing where they're trying to get to this place, this sanctuary type place, which they believe might be safe. And it's the different episodic adventures they have in the way. And it's done with a lot of verve and skill. She writes really well. There are moments which are very genre-esque, like there's things in this called water spiders. Anybody goes near water, big lakes, there's these poisonous spiders. There are mutants in this, and the two central characters are related to that. And that felt a little bit chrysalids, but it's an entirely mature book. So this falls in between a purely mainstream literary approach and a traditional SF one. And it's very, very good indeed. So I would recommend False Dawn. It's very easy to get in paperback in the UK. There are loads of copies out there. The States, I can't say. You can almost certainly get an ebook. If you like a good post-apocalyptic narrative, and if you like one that's towards the end of sort of the road end of things, but it does have nods towards things like A Boy and His Dog as well. And there's some quite brutal things in it, some heartfelt things in it, and the characters become damaged. And I loved it. I thought it was great. All the virtues of great genre fiction, but also good mainstream fiction. And because I've got another copy now, I'm going to let you have the back, because I got that from my friend Graham. So that's for you as well, dear boy. So you can read it and enjoy it. Yeah, there we go. And just as a quick aside, when you mentioned Red Snow earlier on, I flipped this up. This is Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough. This is Crusader's Torch, one of her historical vampire stories. And I managed to get hardcover of this, which I've shown on the channel, and I got this from you, and I know you haven't read it, so you have that back as well. Because I haven't got any space either, really, you see. This is the thing. Neither does he, he's got more than me. Yeah. So that's something, I mean, I am really back into her. I find I read her every summer. And then we come on to a female writer who you have long championed.
Yes.
And, you know, she's another reference book, good interpretation.
Sherry Tepper, The Companions.
Yeah.
So
I can't say I know that one. Golanx.
I think it's
looks like a mainstream novel.
mid-90s.
It's got a beautiful jacket.
A mainstream novel set on other planets.
Right. Okay.
2005.
Yeah.
I'm struggling to read that.
Wow, it's big, isn't it? So tell us all about it.
Yeah. Well, it is, as I said, it's set on another planet.
Right. Okay.
And it's about human colonists coming into conflict with the native, if you can call them native, population,
the native fauna,
and again, it's fauna rather than bow-eyed monsters or anything.
Yeah.
It's mysterious creatures, and it's taken them a hell of a long time to even work out that these are sentient.
Right.
Which I always find quite interesting. I like it when my aliens are enigmatic.
Well, I always say it's like I said in the length and the problem of knowledge. I mean, people think all these things be easy, but they won't. They'll be really hard. And what's the philosophical basis of this? Because there is something in this about how on Earth animals are going to be wiped out.
Yeah,
and deliberately so.
Yeah. Well, basically, Earth is a hell with massive overpopulation. People living in
that sounds familiar.
Yeah. People living in like massive tower blocks and stuff like that. But there's this religious group who are gaining traction, should we say, and their whole kind of belief system is that anything that is non-human, and that includes all the animals on Earth and aliens, should all be destroyed.
That's kind of the opposite of Mercerism in To Android's Dream, isn't it? Yeah, which is seminal that way.
Because we're in God's image, in the image of God, anything that isn't should be killed. So, and it's a common theme in her books.
She's always very aware of environmental concerns, and she's done it a long time. And of course, Grass is in Masterworks, isn't it? Gate to Women's Country is one I've got, and that's long been sort of on the thing. And she is sort of like, I mean, she's one of the major inheritors of the mantle of Ursula Le Guin, isn't she? And I mean, one of the problems with discussing, particularly American literary genre SF by women that's come up since 60s is there's two sort of key influences they fall under. There's Le Guin and Joanna Russ, and most of them fall under Le Guin because Russ was so sharp, and obviously Russ was a lesbian, she was a hardcore feminist, very exciting writer, I think, but very different character to Le Guin. So then this, I don't know this at all, and this must come from that period where I wasn't really paying attention to a lot of that stuff. So it's a bit later, it's 2003. And where did that stand for you in the canon of her works, as I know you're a fan?
It's not as good as Grass, but it is a very good book.
Right, okay.
But like most of these things, would be better with the odd 100 pages shaved off.
Because it's big, isn't it?
But the evocation of the planet and the landscape is stunning, frankly.
Excellent. It's very
the idea that people are just going to go in and destroy this, and this is a theme, a recurring theme.
I see it is today, isn't it? With semiosis there and other things as well. So there you go. So if you were to recommend somebody for entry level into her work, what would you recommend of the ones you've read? Because I know you've read loads.
I guess it could be The Gateway into Women's Country.
The Gateway to Women's Country. Yeah. Okay. Well,
it's not as long as the
no, and that's a keynote book for you as well, isn't it? So isn't that fantastic? Beautiful book.
Because all these books again, they're kind of slide between science fiction and fantasy.
Well, that's an interesting topic. We need to talk about that. We need to talk about that generally at some point, and also in relation to. Let's still call it women's writing by women in SF, and how that is, because the sort of intersection between female writers, and the female writers, female readers, and the SF fantasy divide is an interesting one, isn't it?
But it is quite interesting. It seems to be the 80s.
Yes, where it comes
it kind of you got loads of new female writers.
You've got that generation sort of coming up, haven't you? So there we go. Okay, so moving back a bit further, I've got one more, but you've got a few more. Do you think we should talk about that next, because that would chronologically would be more or less there, wouldn't it? Somebody who died recently, a enormous figure in American letters, Cormac McCarthy, who you and I started reading in the late 80s when Picador. Is it the late 80s?
It was
early 90s.
It was 1993. I read this.
Right. Okay.
So it was almost exactly 30 years since I read this book.
And he's just died.
That I heard that he died.
He wrote The Road, as we know.
It was on the BBC News and the on the radio,
on the red button,
and they were interviewing John Banville.
Yeah.
And he was talking, but they were talking about the predictable stuff like Blood Meridian. But John Banville said that this is a book to read.
Yeah, there is a film.
Funny enough, there is. I was going to bring the DVD out, but I didn't. But I just thought I'm going to read this to celebrate McCarthy.
Yes,
but this is, I've read it at least 3 times.
Yeah, I've not read that one. I know about it, and I've seen part of the film.
But for me, this is the one to read because it's shorter. But it's a brilliant book. It's a very unsettling book.
Tell us about it. I know what
the
basic plot is.
Dysfunctional individual. Who goes around killing people
he's
sexually abusing them after they're dead.
Good grief.
And keeping them around for months.
Okay.
So hiding in caves.
You could say if you wanted, you could call it a horror novel if you wanted to.
Yeah.
But McCarthy obviously transcends that.
Yeah.
And I got the impression that not having read it, having seen some of the film, and I stopped watching the film because I hadn't read the book, and I thought, well, I don't really want to watch a film without having read the book, is very much the idea that this person is somebody who would normally be incarcerated for the protection of everybody else, but they aren't because of the background they come from. Lester Ballard, a solitary and inverted young backwoodsman dispossessed on his ancestral land. So what's the subtext with this? Aside from the events that happen, what is McCarthy telling us? Let's do the lit crit bit. Or is that what it's about, and it's just the writing is good?
Well, for me, it's the writing. It's always been. But it's about how people are. I suppose you could say they're created by society. And he was. I can't remember, frankly, the quite what happened with his family and everything. But basically, he was left on his own, living in kind of semi-derelict houses, and he went off the rails slowly but steadily. But there's no kind of explanation for his actions. He just you'll find a car parked somewhere with a young couple fornicating in it, and he would just decide to kill them, and there's no kind of build up to why he's doing this.
No.
And he just kind of goes. It's like everything is happening by chance.
Let's make a sweeping statement about Cormac McCarthy. He's quite dark, isn't he?
Yes, very dark.
Because that's saying really. But I mean, the thing I find with McCarthy is, I would say, in the books of, I guess I like the conventional ones. The first book I read by him was Suttree, which is his first novel, which must have been early 90s, late 80s, whenever it came out as a Picador. And he'd been going a long time then, but he was somebody who was suddenly kind of discovered at that stage. And Suttree is like a Southern American Gothic. It's very ornate and verbose and chewy and stylistically very lush, almost too much so. But I found with other things like No Country for Old Men is very stripped down, too stripped down for me. And I always compare it to a book which I feel is better, which is Two Honest Straits by Kem Nunn, which I think is a similar story but much better expressed. And then of course, as you say, the conventional one's The Road, which we've talked about many times already, because it is such a good book, such an important book. And the Western Blood Meridian, which is written in a kind of biblical style, and it's the biblical style of that. So McCarthy tends to be very verbose, very stripped down, and sometimes there's a combination of the two. And I think that's when he does his best writing.
With Blood
Where
Meridian,
would that stand?
With Blood Meridian, for me, it was the writing.
Oh yeah.
And I almost ignored the plot.
Yeah, it's
some ways
like Moby Dick, isn't it?
People will be talking about the plot, and I think, I didn't notice that.
I think
this
McCarthy,
because it is more stripped down.
It's just for him to hang the writing on, isn't it? And it's not that the plot's unimportant. He plots well, but the plots are often quite straightforward.
When I read this, I thought it was his best book. But I'm less inclined that way now.
And that's your third reader.
Yeah, third reader.
So there you go.
But it could be just familiarity, old age.
Well, Well, the interesting about rereading is that you sometimes change your view. You
sometimes hate something.
Yeah, it is very interesting when you do that, and that's another reason why rereading is good, because it's close reading of the text as well. So you pay a bit more attention to the style and what have you. So that's Cormac McCarthy, Child of God. So if you've read the obvious ones and not read that one, give it a go. Let us know what you think. So that's a good one to do. We're going to move back now. I'm going to go next because these are older books, and this one that I've got here will tie in nicely with that one there. Okay, so again, not a very exciting cover. This is Blind Voices by Tom Reamy, again in Sidgwick Silver. There was a really nice penguin of this in the late 70s. Now, Tom Reamy died very young. Now, I'd read short stories by him, and I hadn't read this, and I've been aware of it for decades.
San Diego Lightfoot
Sue, which is a great story, really good. And that was shortlisted for or won a Nebula in the late 70s. And he was sort of tip for the top, and he died, I think, in about 1980-81. This was the only novel. I think there's other short stories. It was published by Berkeley, 78, and then 79. And I think he died in 79 because it says your copyright, the estate of Tom Reamy. And this is a UK first. And these are quite easy to get, and the Penguin paper is easy to get. And Harlan Ellison used to rave about him. And he was going to be the next big thing, or so people like Ellison would say. But my feeling is that he would have got caught in the rush of those generally very, very good writers who came up in America in the 70s, who wrote SF and fantasy. And the SF they wrote was often quite fabula and sort of fantasy based. I'm thinking of people like John Crowley. I'm thinking of people like, I've thought of it, Jonathan Carroll, Mark Helprin, people who were writing at the more fantastic end of the spectrum and were getting lots of acclaim. They never ever had massive sales, and this is what I think would have happened to Tom Reamy. We'll be interested to see what he did next, but just to talk about this is very Bradbury-esque. What I would say is like a combination of Something Wicked This Way Comes and More Than Human. Okay, so it's the 1920s. It's a small American town. A carnival train, a load of trucks drawn by horses and what have you, and cars, comes into this small town. The people are sort of like in the middle of nowhere, this little society there, and the way that the milieu of the town and the characters is described remind me a bit of The Last Picture Show by Larry McMurtry, which is a great novel from the 50s, or set in the 50s, and this is the 20s, as I say. And when you read this, you instantly get that Bradbury thing. It's not quite as lyrical, it's not quite as old-fashioned, but you can see why the likes of Ellison, who loved stuff from his childhood, he loved that nostalgic thing, the way America was, would jump on it. And this carnival comes into this town, and it's run by this seemingly rapacious character, or two characters who are quite rapacious. And they have this sort of sideshow of freaks. And even though you could read this and be forgiven for thinking it's fantasy, it's not. And it's clearly indicated by one of the characters in the text that the strange beings in the carnival are mutants or throwbacks to a previous civilization rather than it being anything supernatural. So it is an SF novel. That's indicated many times clearly in the text. And it's about what happens when this carnival comes into town and the beings in the show interact with the ordinary people. And as I say, it's very much like the Bradbury. It's very much like More Than Human in lots of ways because the characters have these certain interactions. It also invariably makes you think of Todd Browning's film Freaks as well, the one that was banned way back in the 30s. And it's really good. The writing is very measured. It's not overly cluttered with too much description, but yet there's lyricism there. It has all the familiar cliches that you would want from these things, like of course in the town there's a sarsaparilla bar, so there's a massive Bradbury influence. If you like Fritz Leiber, you probably like this, but it's very, very, very finely written, a great book to read in the summer. And it's a shame because it points toward what would have been an interesting career. I personally don't think that Reamy would have become the bestseller.
No,
I think he was... There's nothing old school about this book for when it was written, but he is working in a tradition of the circus of Dr. Lau, Jack Finney, Bradbury, as I say. But it is really good, so pick it up and read it. Beautifully written, wonderful characterization. exciting plot, not always unpredictable, but a really lovely summer read. And if you like carnivals, circuses and that whole thing, there's nothing postmodern about it. It's not Knights of the Circus by Angela Carter. It has all those things, and there's references to Greek mythology and stuff, and at times it reminded me of some of C.L. Moore's stories, except it's not as florid, because she used to refer to mythology and ancient history as well. And really good. And what a shame. I would have been fascinated to see what he did next. That's Tom Reamy, Blind Voices, so you can pick it up fairly easily. Penguin paperback in the UK, out of print, there's loads out there. And I think this cost me £5. So there you go. So a neglected minor to major classic from the late 70s. Great stuff. Which leads us on to another book which you've just read and which is a favourite book of mine.
Ray Bradbury.
Dandelion Wine.
Dandelion Wine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For me, Bradbury's finest novel. Not essentially his most original.
Yeah.
But probably his finest. So what have we got to say about Dandelion?
Well, weirdly, I was looking in my little notebook where I write down what I've read, because otherwise I forget.
You're more
everything.
than a number in his little red book.
I discovered I hadn't read it.
You hadn't read it?
I could not believe.
Shocking.
It's possible I have read it.
I've read that 3 times.
But
I remember.
forgot to put it in the book.
Yeah,
possibly.
Yeah.
But it is very similar to the Tom Reamy.
This is same edition as mine, Grafton.
It's set in a summer primarily in an American, what would it be, 19? Turn of the century?
Yeah, maybe a bit later.
Yeah, maybe a bit later.
Yeah. And it's Douglas Spalding is the young man. And I've summed this up before by saying about he goes to one summer and he starts as a boy and he finishes as a man.
Yeah.
So he's pubertal. He's going through that
Well, that's a funny thing about it is the style in which it's written. At the beginning, it is very kind of over the top, full of the joys. Florid, that's the word. Yeah. And then gradually it gets darker and darker. Yeah. And you get people who are dying. Like there's a guy who's going murdering ladies and stuff like that. There's also a few weird contractions in there, like somebody says he's got a time machine, but in reality it's an old bloke
Heath Robinson
who's
stuff,
but it's an old bloke who's it's his memory as a time machine,
and
stuff like that. And there's an awful lot of the kind of contrast between this youth and old age. You get a young guy who falls in love with like a 95-year-old, and
it's very much the thing that I mentioned I hinted at it in one of my Capri videos, the one where I go to San Michaela, where there's a Sphinx, and I mentioned the riddle of the Sphinx, which was the riddle of the Sphinx is from Sophocles, Oedipus Rex, where the question the Sphinx asks is what begins life on 4 legs, then goes on to 2 legs, and then transforms on 3 legs. And of course, as a human being, you crawl, then you stand when you're mature, and then you have a stick when you're old, you have a cane. And it's very much that sort of thing. So this is a book which is very lush and absolutely blissful. I love this book. And everything, this for me is quintessential Bradbury. And there are lots of short stories like The Day Ran Forever.
It does have the feel of a collection of short stories, though. Which is I thought was quite interesting.
It's a novel, but again, it's episodic. And there's also Something Wicked This Way Comes is like this, except what I like about this is a mainstream novel. Nothing supernatural actually happens. Nothing science fiction actually happens. But a lot of it is, you can tell that, this is the childhood that Bradbury had or wanted to have. And there is a sequel called Farewell Summer, which came out a long time afterwards, I think in the 90s, and nowhere near as good, because by then Bradbury was retreading the same ground, and he was doing that, I think, by the 80s. And that's why I'm less interested in his other work. And you grow up, and Bradbury is something to read when you're young, but you go back to when you're older, and there's just such wisdom and joy and lyricism is overused, but that's the way to put it. It is very much the song of summer, but there's dark stuff in it, and I love it. So you think you hadn't read it before?
I think I hadn't read it, which I'm amazed at. But it could be the print. The print's horrible.
Yeah, well, when I did that, Bradbury...
It's small and very dense.
Yeah, I found that with my Golden Apples of the Sun. Yeah. And this, of course, is a Grafton. Mine's slightly earlier than this. I bought mine a few years, so mine's Granada. It's the same cover. But Dandelion Wine... is, for me, is my favourite Bradbury novel. And so I've read it several times. I think it's 3 times, maybe more. I need to go back to it. But the whole thing about Fahrenheit 451, which has a pastoral feel, very pastoral stuff, very American, absolutely gorgeous, timeless beauty. is what I would say. And you obviously enjoyed it as well.
I did,
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, as you say, it's beautifully written.
Yeah.
But it's like the initial few pages, though, you think this is a bit over the top.
Yeah.
But then it does come true after.
It's intoxicating stuff.
Is,
it really, really is. I remember the sequence now with the character who brews the Dandelion wine in his basement. Yeah, that's good stuff. Which makes you think of other Bradbury stories like Boys, Grow Giant Mushrooms in Your Cellar, things like that.
Well, people did that back
titles.
then. They used to make their own homemade wine. They used to bottle fruit. They used to.
And there's a lot of that in Bradbury, isn't there? There's a lot of that homespun stuff, which seems very twee now. But maybe there's a lot to be said for that quieter approach to life. Okay, then we're coming on to one of the or two of the big three. Heinlein and Asimov.
I decided to read. I ought to read some more Asimov, having not read him for 30 odd years.
Yeah,
because I'm forever criticising him.
Yeah.
And saying, and I thought, well, maybe I should
I've
give
got
him a go.
Bicentennial, but I've never read it.
Yeah, so it's a collection of robot short stories. Funnily enough, and funny thing about Asimov, I'm always saying it's the writing, which is not very good.
Yeah.
And in fact, the first time I ever read anything of his was back in the 1970s. One of the foundation books.
Yeah.
A friend of mine at school lent it to me, and I thought it was the driest, most boring thing I've ever read in my life.
Of course.
Reading this has proved to me that I'm absolutely right.
Right. Okay.
The writing is, to me, terrible. It's so boring.
Yeah. So you're not.
It's interesting that David Pringle in the Xanadu book.
100 science fiction, the 100 best novels.
He actually says in there that he wouldn't have included Asimov in there.
No,
because his writing.
David
but he thought because his shadow is so great, he had to put him in.
This was the thing for me and Nick as well when we did 100 Must-Read Science Fiction Novels, because 100 Must-Read Science Fiction Novels was about getting an overview of the field, and because Asimov has been so lauded and influential. This is later robot stories, of course, as well. Now, I do have this, but I've not read it. Now,
but having given the impression I'm criticising it, I actually think that works quite well, because the ideas are there, the plots are there, and in a shorter format, they actually, I think, is a perfectly enjoyable book. The writing is as dull as hell, but the ideas rise above that.
Yeah, he's not a great stylist, is he? No,
right.
This is the thing. And what I find, I've not read these, I do have this. I was a born-again Ikeite a few years ago, where when I was younger, I read or tried to read Foundation and the early robot stories, the Susan Calvin ones, and they are as clunky as hell. I still think they're as clunky as hell. They have some good ideas, but the way they're expressed, it just didn't work for me at all. And of course, in terms of the context, the time that stuff was being written, the things I was reading, I was always fonder of the new wave people and the people who came up in the 50s and the people of the golden age. And so I must read this. But a few years back, I read the first two robot novels, Caves of Steel and Naked Sun, and I absolutely loved them. Now, they have crime plots, but they're very, very good. They're short. But then, of course, I moved on to the two later robot novels, the big ones, Robots of Dawn and Robots and Empire. And I loved those as well, even though they're very big. The critics hated them. They said it's all padded. But I like the strangeness and stateliness. There's something about Asimov which is kind of, prudish is the wrong word. They are incredibly old school in lots of ways. There's this sort of stately progression of things, and there's the obsession in those books with toilets. They call them personals, and there's all this working through. And of course, if you read Foundation, it's people talking in rooms. You don't get these huge descriptions of of ornate space battles and what. It's mostly conceptual things and tricks. And of course, he wrote a lot of crime fiction as well, and he was a scientist, problem solver. So I need to read this now. Bearing in mind.
So, funnily enough, in one of those stories, you actually get a robot meeting Hugo Gernsback.
Right.
And
they
literally sit next to him on a park bench kind of thing. And he tells him all about scientification. And that's the term he's come up with. And I thought we ought to have had Steve Andrews sat there.
There's a story called Birth of a Notion, which is a reference to D.W. Griffith as well. But I am going to read this. I've got a copy of it because I got into those. I still think the robot books are the best ones, but I'm not fond of iRobot and the rest of the robots, the Susan Calvin. I just don't think they're very well written. And, so I need to read that as well. I got a Grafton one. So what that did for you was confirm your suspicions.
That he
and
is
your
not a
feelings.
great writer.
No.
Having said that, there's nothing wrong about it. You see, back in the 80s, all people like Asimov and Clarke were bestsellers.
Yeah.
You'd see their books being published. They'd be in the charts and
this
stuff
is what
like
we
in
mean
W.H.
by
Smith,
the big four, the day of the dumping, as Brian Alder said.
Yeah.
What you can remember is, because these weren't books when they were first published, you didn't get books with science fiction written on the cover until the 1950s, and you didn't get lots of paperbacks till the end of the 50s and the early 60s. So when science fiction moved into the mainstream of literature out of the ghetto gradually through the 60s, largely through the way the social changes you had with the hippies and what have you, by the time it became a major commercial thing, because publishing grew gradually more commercial. And interestingly, there's a dedication of this to Judy Lynn Del Rey, who took over Del Rey Books after Lester, who was responsible for Terry Brooks and what have you, and really sort of pushed things through. Even in work now, I was in work a few years ago, and I heard a young chap who must have been 20 saying to a friend, Isaac Asimov, he's the go-to science fiction writer. And generally, you're talking about the works are acclaimed works, are written in the 30s and 40s. I mean, it's almost ancient history, and people are fixated on the new, and I don't think they should be. I think they should be looking at all periods of literature. But it just goes to show that these people, they grew more and more famous. Now, let's talk about the 90s briefly. Why, if the modern and the contemporary are so good, are people reading things from the 90s and the noughties? There you go, because they're still busy reading these. Is there a reason for that? Is it because they're more famous, because they're hyped, they've got the weight of history behind them? Is it that they're better? That we move on to another time. So let's finish with another, and this is a really nice copy. This has had lots of covers. So this is a nice signet edition of The Puppet Masters by Robert Anson Heinlein, from 1953, I believe. Let's have a look. 1951, that's right, 1951. That's gorgeous, really nice one. Slight spine lean, but nothing that will give us too much fear, because it's pristine. And this can't be your only copy, you must have another copy of this.
That is the only one, actually.
Shock horror pro. I have a pan lozenge, as you'd expect.
Yeah.
So
I think I did have one, but somebody stole it from me.
Right.
But I read him for similar reasons to the Asimov, and he's somebody I'm a bit sniffy about.
Yeah.
But again, it reaffirmed my feelings about him, that he's not the greatest writer in the world.
No.
But basically his earlier books, and particularly shorter books, and in particular his juveniles, are what generally referred to as his juveniles. And I can mention David Pringle again, because he makes the same reference, that the juveniles are often his best work.
Citizen of the Galaxy, things like that.
Yeah. And that is a good book. It's not amazingly written. The prose style to me is very kind of workmanlike, and the characters are always somebody military or quasi-military and whatever.
They're folks who are getting things done.
Yes, which I don't find very appealing.
No.
But still, it's a good book.
Yeah. Well,
it's about aliens coming to Earth, and they basically replace people in cities, so you don't
are property.
So it's similar to
Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the Crace experiment,
all those sorts of things.
And
these bunch of people are they're almost having to engage in World War III.
Yes,
in order to try and so it's almost like they're killing everyone in order to save them. And
what I liked about this, I mean, first of all, I do think this is influential, and in some cases it might have influenced, might not have influenced one of the people I'm going to talk about. The books I just mentioned. This is 51. Then shortly after that, you had Jack Finney's The Body Snatchers, filmed as Invasion of the Body Snatchers, twice in that title. Don Siegel in the 50s, amazing. Then there's the Philip Korff one, late 70s, also amazing. Then you get the Abel Ferrara one, early 90s, which is just called The Body Snatchers, which is less good, even though Ferrara's good. And then you've got the terrible one, which is just called The Invasion, which we won't go near. But that theme, Reds under the bed, paranoia, there are aliens amongst us, it's one of the cliches of 1950s SF and the way it's interpreted, isn't it? But there is a sort of element of truth in it. And Finney, I prefer the Finney book in terms of the style. I do think this moves pacily, it's straight ahead. Yes. I enjoyed it enormously. It's one of my favourite Heinlein books, and I don't like many, but I enjoyed this one. But I also thought about Nigel Neal, Quatermass 2 particularly. Quatermass Experiment is 53. Quatermass 2 is about 56. And in America, they're better known as films than TV series. The first film is called The Creepy Unknown in the States. The second film is called Enemy from Space. And again, it's people being taken over by aliens but retaining sort of human form. And I really enjoy this. And I have mentioned this before on the channel. The thing about this is it's a great example of what the novum is in SF. And it's not in the, I always say it's the first line, it's not. There's a very short first paragraph. In the second paragraph, and is set in 2007, and this is 1951, and the central character's mobile phone rings. There were no mobile phones until the 80s, and they were the size of house bricks. Mobile phone goes off. Instantly, if there was nothing else in this, which was an SF trope, this would be an SF novel. Because you don't do these things for the sake of it. Writers put them in for a reason. They make a point about society, technology, how it changes human beings. This mobile phone goes off. And that instantly, it's got you're awake, you think, oh wow, okay, what's going on here? And there's that funny thing in this where the character calls his boss the old man, doesn't he? We're not going to do any spoilers around that. There is quite a fun film of this from the 80s and 90s with
I don't think I've ever seen it.
It's quite good fun. It's not front rag, but it's worth seeing. And it's got Donald Sutherland in it, which is another link to Body Snatchers, because Donald Sutherland, of course, is the main character in the 78 remake. I really enjoyed this, but I enjoyed it in the level of a caper and a runabout, and it was sharp and fleet. And I love the title, Puppet Masters. It's good. So, and that's a beautiful addition.
So it's an example of how his best books are his short books.
There you go. Yeah.
Simple.
And then, of course, the 60s happened, Strange Land. Everything got sort of bloated and about him and about sex and very prurient and what have you. So that's our kind of reviews roundup. We haven't laughed a lot today.
No.
Probably because we're being serious and we're trying to get across the seriousness of what we're doing. So I hope you enjoyed that. We will do some more out and about stuff. We had a good, that was a funny time when we went to Frome. That was good.
It was,
So we'll do more like that. And we're talking about other things all the time. But we sort of got to get on with other stuff now. So it's great to have you back on the channel, Graham. Thank you very much. Good to get this books back to you. And I certainly, after that, feel I really need to look at the Jim Crace and Ian MacLeod particularly, Return to Grim Chase and to Grim Chase. That's a good name, isn't it? Perhaps that'll be one of my pseudonyms, Grim Chase. To write crime novels, Grim Chase, Ace Detective. You can see that happening. Anyway, Outlaw Bookseller, signing out for now. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, super thanks, all that stuff. And we'll be back with you again soon. Bye for now.
Bye.